And I remember my mother always telling me that I was pretty lucky because the rest of my siblings were dark hair, straight, and they looked very Native American. She said, "Well, you're lucky. You're going to be able to go through life like this," and which meant that people wouldn't notice me as much, and I wouldn't get as much whatever you call it, ridicule or picked on, whatever. And
racism.
right, I wouldn't face the racism part. Yeah, and I would. I guess she must have thought that I would have some type of privilege, and I suppose I kind of did. Like as I was going through, and as opposed to my sisters, and but I remember the one thing that I felt like I was lucky about was that I had asthma when I was young and allergies, and whether you feel that was lucky or not, I did, because when it came to my history book in school, I could go ahead and see what the teacher was going to be studying the next day, or was going to be teaching us the next day or the day after, and I could go home and I could fake an asthma attack or allergies and pretend I was sick, so that I didn't have to go to school. And that was, the way that I got out of school. I got out of not going into my class because I was also very shy, and I didn't want anybody to pick on me. And I learned that in school, that once the teacher found out that I was Native American, she asked me, she said, "Oh my God, I can't believe that, you're Native American." And then I just kind of went like, I grew up in Rochester, like everyone else. I was learning what everybody else was learning at that time. What was different in my household was that my mother spoke the Mohawk language fluently and with our relatives, but it was also a language that I thought everyone else in in their own homes had a language, because when my parents my mother and my aunts would speak Mohawk, and then we'd come in because my mother didn't teach us, what would happen is that we'd walk into the room and my mother they would immediately change, and they'd start speaking in Mohawk and then start laughing. And then one time I said, "Why do you do that? How come every time we come in and you change and you start speaking Mohawk?" And she said, "So we can talk about you." And I just started laughing, but I thought all adults had a special language that they could talk about their kids. And that's kind of the way that I grew up, though. It wasn't that I grew up knowing the Mohawk language or how important it was or anything like that. I was learning just like everyone else was. And I guess I just think that, I got away with going to school because of, what was in the book. I didn't want to see that. So I got away with staying out of school because, I could fake an illness. And I don't know if any of you guys well, I know illness, but, had any experiences in school or anything like that, like where you kind of felt different also.
Well, when you were talking about that, I was thinking about identity. And I have had, I grew up on a reservation and went to, public school off the reservation. And, there was a lot of res kids in school, but I was so confused because of images in media, I always talk about the Land O'Lakes maiden on the, the butter maiden. And, that's what I thought an Indian was supposed to look like. And I didn't look like an Indian. I had curly hair. I didn't think I was the right brown. And so I was always trying to figure out how my parents put together, because I wasn't sure they were Indian. At one point, I thought my dad was Puerto Rican, you know, because he had curly hair and he was dark. And so I was just really confused about, you know, us pretending to be Indians. And I'm just like, I don't know why we're here, you know, we're not really Indian, but we're on the res. Like, how did we get here? And, you know, and in high school it was embarrassing because I was still trying to figure out who I was. And, you know, like, those images in the media are harmful because it made me question my very own identity. And it's, you know, and it's embarrassing to talk about it too, you know. I don't think I ever felt like I really belong anywhere.
Because of not looking like Pocahontas.
Yeah, because you know, I didn't have blonde flowing hair, I wasn't skinny, you know, like all the, you know, like even when you see like the Indian costumes, you know, like those gross Halloween Indian bikini, hot woman costumes, like, I don't look like that either. You know, like they look more Indian than I do, they're not. You know?
I had an experience that, so we have a longhouse where we take care of our ceremonial way of life. And when we go there, if we're participating, we can put on our traditional clothing. This is just the shirt that goes with the outfit. So I had gotten dressed outdoors at my car, and I was about to go into the longhouse when I saw a woman and her 2 children beginning to walk toward the women's side of the longhouse. And one of the little boys turned to me and he said to his mother, "Look, Mom, an Indian." So, of course, they were Indian. His mother and the children were Indian, but because I had an outfit on with a headdress, you know, to him, I was the Indian.
You're an actual Indian.
I was an actual Indian. And it was so ironic. She didn't know what to do except to just kind of rush the kids into the building, and I just started laughing because they look so much more Indian than me. I mean, if you met them on the street, you'd recognize them because of their complexion. Anyways, one of those ironies.
I think that it's also difficult for us too, you know, like when we're growing up off the reservation, I thought that, you know, our cousins and everyone who lives on the reservation, you know, those were the Indians, and they knew a lot. And also, I also thought the good things about it, which were that our people were farmers, because that's what I remember my family doing. They were farmers, and you know, they raised big, huge gardens, and you know, and we were eating the food that they raised whenever we went there, and that was all great. But yet, I also felt like off the reservation that when I would meet someone who was not Native American, and sometimes, you know, like growing up and you're going out more, and people seem to think like I was like a walking history book, you know, like talking to me, like, and then saying, "Oh, what about that war?" You know, and talking about something about history. And I said, I never made history class because I didn't like history, so I was always sick. I don't know what war you're talking about. You know, I just didn't, you know, I just didn't know how to deal with it. And then come to find out, I just felt like, you know, people have assumptions about us as Native American people, that we don't all know our history, and we don't all look alike. We don't, you know, we have different behaviors, we have different ways that we do things, just like everyone else. The difference is that, you know, there is language that we can learn, and there is, you know, there is a territory that we can go home to, you know, and that even kind of sucks too, because, you know, thinking like, we have to go home to a territory when all of this used to be ours.
Well, I feel like me and Angel have been having that conversation a lot lately, like exactly all the stuff we were just talking about. Because, you know, we're talking about someone who, you know, back home on the res, you know, on their social media talks about like, this is sacred land, and I was like, well, it's all sacred land. And I said, you know, I had to really reconcile moving off the reservation. And, you know, I know my reasons for doing it when Angel was a baby. You know, it was for him, and, you know, eventually his brother too. And, you know, and that was scary. And then, you know, I had this conversation with my aunt when I had quit drinking. You know, I was just trying to make sense of like, you know, my whole experience, and I made a comment about how, you know, like, you know, my drinking problem came from growing up on the reservation, and I think I said, you know, like, this place is shit, and she got upset, and she's like, you know, my mother grew up here, I grew up here, and you're calling my homeland shit, and, you know, and I came back, and I had to think about it, and, you know, like, what I came to, the point that I came to was like, this is where our people originated from, like, this is our ancestral land, physically. And so I started thinking of it as more of a homecoming. You know, this is where I'm ancestrally from. And, you know, I'm very lucky and privileged to be able to live here. And then I had to have a conversation with her about, you know, like, you know, I said, you know, well, I just recently quit drinking, and I'm just trying to figure out, like, you know, all that stuff, you know, it's like untangling everything. And then, you know, me and Angel talk about, you know, how he grew up off the res, and, you know, like, what that experience is like. You wanna talk about that?
Well, there's such a disconnect for me, because growing up there was, being here in Victor, living in a place where I was surrounded by our history and where our people originally came from. And then to go back home and visit family, and it was just a completely different environment, a completely different energy and atmosphere. And they knew like their songs and their dances and like our ceremonies, and I didn't really have that much knowledge on that, but I knew where it all came from, whereas they did not. And I was able to see the different behaviors with people back home, with the intergenerational trauma that they have, and how it's continuing from generation to generation. And then coming here and spending all this time with these white people, going to school with these white kids who come from families with money, and just that it really felt like living two different lives, having two separate identities, and not knowing how to fit fully into either. And I mean, that was difficult growing up, slowly learning the differences, because I would go back home and they would make certain jokes that I would bring back here and just no one understood. It didn't make any sense, or being embarrassed because I would say something that people would laugh at on the reservation, and then the people out here just would be like, that's awful, why would you say that? Like, that's not funny. And it's that dark humor that comes from our trauma. And even still, like, I have my own trauma, and because of that, I have a hard time reading the room. I have a hard time having conversations. I have a hard time reading other people. And I'm still, to this day, finding those things where, like, I'll say something and someone will kind of look at me weird. And I have such a hard time figuring out why. Like, I don't understand. I said this to, like, this person and it was fine, it was funny, it, like, made sense, and now these people don't get it. I don't understand where it came from, like, where's the root of it. Having to analyze every single thing that I'm thinking and saying to people and the behaviors that I'm showing people. it takes a lot of analyzing, it takes a lot of energy, just to be around people, and I found myself, secluding a lot. I don't like leaving my house often now. I don't really like going to the grocery store. I don't like going to events. I don't like interacting a lot with people because it takes a lot of energy, a lot of thought to figure out how to fit in here. How am I going to feel comfortable in this space or this space? And then overanalyzing.
Kind of similar to the beginning of what you're saying about having those two different kind of identities and figuring out where things all fit. I come from a people with no reservation. There are no reservations in the state where I'm from. Up until last year, there were no recognized Native nations in that state. So it's a lot different. So there is no res to go back to, but there is homes, there's communities, some places where nobody ever actually moved, just the state took away the status of the people. And so you can go to different farms, you can go to different communities and meet with people. And for me, what was different was growing up here, I grew up watching Haudenosaunee culture. And even though, you know, a lot of people were learning it right along with me, when you're going down south and you have people who are literally trying to pick up the pieces, trying to rebuild languages, trying to rebuild ceremonies, because it was all erased away. So being down there and just seeing, it's that, you know, trying to respect all the work that's going on, but also it just feels so different than being up here, and trying to figure out where you fit in both.
Yeah, for sure. I've been doing a lot of trauma work lately, a lot of processing. And the past couple of weeks, what I've really been coming back to is this idea of the residential schools. My personal trauma is from when I was younger. And to think that traumatic event that happened to me was caused by someone who must also be hurting, who's also been through a similar experience, to make them believe that what they did to me was okay. And to not really think about it in a negative way. And so then who did it to them? And then what happened to that person? And then the one before that? And this is a line of Native people that in my thoughts, I'm drawing back to, and it all just goes back to residential schools. The way they were treated was passed down, and years later is still continuing.
It's perpetuating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's being played out over and over again.
Yeah.
So, I grew up in a border town, on the border of the reservation and the white world. And the reservation was across the creek, and I grew up, you know, on the opposite side. My grandmother, my cousins, the church we went to, all were on the res. And so we moved back and forth daily, and, you know, to go and visit, or pick up my grandmother, or pick up my uncle, or whatever we were doing. And yet, the border town was so different in many ways than the res. We had a general store that was the post office, the place where you could buy rope, where you could buy nails, where you could buy clothing, where you could buy bologna, where you could buy cheese, and all of those smells were in the general store. And everybody came into town because there were no supermarkets yet at that time when I was growing up. And the other thing the town had was a school, had a diner, it had a gas station, and it also had a hotel. And that's where people came to drink. And about the 1950s, maybe the middle of the 1950s, was the time when Indians were allowed to go inside of a bar to drink. So what I experienced was, on the outside of the bar was the group that we called the Jug Gang. They were drinking something that they also referred to as chemicals. It was supposed to be hard cider, but it didn't really contain much of apples. It was made out of some sort of who knows what, and that's why they called it chemicals. And then inside, people drank draft beer. But it was like a setting like this. People just sat there and socialized. People just came and went, and at times I would walk in and I would know the people because my friend's father owned the place. I would cut through this one room, see the people sitting there, and maybe one of my relatives would call me over and introduce me to all the people at the table, and I would have a mix of embarrassment and saying hello to everybody and not knowing what I'm supposed to do other than just say hello, and then make my way out of there and go and find my friend. And of course I wasn't even supposed to go through that part of the building. I was supposed to go in an entrance, which was a private entrance, but as kids we just went in whatever door was open. But we really lived outdoors as children. We spent most of our days in the woods, along the creek, in the water, outdoors. And we, on the res, we followed paths through the woods. We ate what was ever growing seasonally. We ran along the side of the creek. We made things out of clay. We ran foot races. We just literally lived in the woods. And that was kind of like, that was life. And at the same time, when I got to about 7th grade, the school centralized. And for the first time, all the different rural schools, we were brought together in one school, one centralized school. And now, we met all the kids from the white town, the big white town. And we came from these littler communities. And it was difficult because the school in the town that I went to was very relaxed. Like I said, we're outdoors. We would spend as much time outdoors as we spent in the classroom some weeks. And some days we would be playing dodgeball every morning. Played dodgeball for an hour, maybe 2 hours, whatever. And then we go upstairs and we go to class. And all of this was just considered to be our education, this is what you did. The last thing I would say is, I always refer to the town I grew up in as a multicultural town, because we had a canning factory, and we had farmers. And the farmers employed people from Jamaica, from Haiti, from Puerto Rico, and so they came to live there in the summertime as my next door neighbors, living in housing provided to them. In the canning factory, there were people who came from Italy who lived in dormitory-style housing, had their own building, and then they worked in the canning factory. And then the people from the hills around the town, they came to work in the canning factory. Native people worked in the canning factory. Black people from the south worked in the canning factory. So all these different people working in that community during the season when the canning took place. And they canned beans, they canned tomatoes, they canned beets. And every time they let go of the water that they had been using in the processing, the creek turned whatever color. It turned pink when the beets water came out into the creek, and it turned red when the remains of tomatoes came out into the creek. And nobody thought about pollution, nobody thought about, people would walk over to the bridge going across the res, or across the creek, and drop their garbage in a paper bag into the creek, which then went down to the mouth of Lake Erie, where it emptied into the lake.
Where was the canning
canning factory was between the two tracks in Irving, you know where your sister lived, right behind there,
Okay.
right behind there, that's where the canning factory is.
I didn't know.
It burned down when I was in high school. Everyone who worked in the canning factory earned $1 an hour, regardless of what you did. You earned $1 an hour. Anyway. And I guess the last thing I would say was, never a single word about Senecas. The reservation was right there. We were in school, we were not taught a thing about the fact that there were Senecas in the school system, that there were Senecas in the school, that the Senecas lived down the road, nothing. We were, in that sense, invisible, but of course we weren't invisible because everyone looked Seneca. So if you didn't look Seneca, your last name told them who you were, you know, but that's the way it was in the early 60s and the 50s. They didn't teach anything about us. Everything I learned, I taught myself as I got older. I had to go and learn for myself whatever I wanted to learn about what it meant to be Seneca.
I'm finding that I think that's how we all have to learn. I mean, we can give each other direction and get direction from our parents or guardians or the adults around us. But I don't think we could really understand what that means to be about our people without going on that journey ourselves. So I mean, I think that's the best way to learn.
I connected with these two young women back home. Actually, they're both my cousins, I don't think they know it. But my one cousin told her, but they were, putting together a walk to raise awareness for mental health on the res. And, you know, being a therapist and, you know, being like a substance abuse counselor, you know, I told them, like, whatever knowledge you need, you know, I can help, you know, we can promote mental health and stuff. And so we had this meeting on Zoom, and, you know, they were talking, and I heard these two young women say, you know, I don't know what it means to be Seneca. And, you know, in grad school, like, you know, that's when I started researching historical trauma, and I started to find so many answers about myself, my behaviors, my thoughts, and all that stuff. And you know, I came to this theory that, like, you know, we have to find our identity. You know, we have to form our identity because, you know, it was taken from us in boarding schools. And actually, this morning I was thinking about it, and I was like, would that make the U.S. government like the first identity thieves? Like, you know, our identity was stolen. So, you know, like I started to talk about, you know, like our healing, our healing path and our recovery is in going back to our roots, and it's, you know, learning language and learning about plant medicines, like learning whatever you can, you know, whatever pulls you, and, you know, like that's why I always encourage you to garden and, you know, talk to plants, you know, because that's your gift. And my gift is cooking, you know, and, you know, we need to connect to that, you know, because I think, you know, we talked about identity and, you know, what does that really mean? And it's, you know, I think it's a big theme that we confront on different levels.
Get a little closer to the microphone so I don't have to shout as much. There's been a lot of different topics that have been discussed here, and I'm kind of sitting back here. First, I'm trying to remember what this event is about racism in Native Indigenous peoples. So that's one element. And then we're coming in here to play Monopoly, and it's been decades since I played Monopoly last, and I never really thought about it before, and I like how they put the different rules in here. And then here, the table they were talking about identity and where they belong and things like that. So, and we started out, as you know, with our Ganondagan, with our Thanksgiving address, that Pete shared in the beginning. So I'm sitting back here and trying to put all these pieces together into some thoughts I wanted to share with you, because there's so many different things that have been addressed or could be addressed. And so one of the things that we were just talking about now is like the idea of where do I fit and where do I belong? And being Cayuga, we lost our land base back in the 1790s. So since 1790s until about 10 years ago or so, maybe a little bit longer, we've been referred to as the homeless Cayugas, that we had no land base to go back to. Some of our people, during the time of the American Revolution, went up to Canada. So a lot of Cayuga people up there. Some people went further to, there's a group of Seneca Cayuga people out in Oklahoma. So, and then there's people, Cayuga people all across the US. So really it's widespread and diverse where people went to. Some people stayed in the local areas, here in Rochester, here in Buffalo. Some people moved in with the Seneca Nation at Cattaraugus and different places. But all this time being known and referred to as homeless, as a nation, as a people, is something that underlies this whole thing about monopoly and the game that we played. Because when Pete started out with our Thanksgiving address, and we kind of talked about this as well, where we live, if we live on territory, or do we live in the city of Rochester, New York City, wherever. One thing I've always been taught is that no matter we go on our Mother Earth, we're connected. Because our longhouse doesn't end at the door of the longhouse. The longhouse is a sky, is all the land, is all of our people. So it isn't just one place, it's all creation is everywhere. It's each one of us. So when he starts out with that Thanksgiving address, and to say that we are connected to our Mother Earth, we don't own the earth, we belong to it. We don't. So, and that's what really struck me about this game of Monopoly. Because here in Monopoly, it teaches young kids, it taught me, it taught many of us who might have played, the whole idea of individual ownership of property and accumulation and wealth and intergenerational things. I was player number 2, so I had to play, I was nearly broke. I didn't buy anything and I didn't go anywhere around the board, partly because of those rules. But that's so much real life for so many people. One question I had about, I didn't ask it, I didn't say it, but what about homeless people? Because this country nowadays has more homeless people than has ever been. And not that they're doing anything wrong. Some people have issues with addictions or whatever else, or trauma. But other people who are homeless have medical issues. We look at the cost of any kind of surgery now. We're talking about $20,000 for a little simple routine procedure. So that, the whole medical field is another part of that problem. But we look at the board, that's what I thought about, because I've been homeless in my time. I had about 1.5 years, 2 years, where I didn't have a place to stay. So I know what that feels like. I also, in the game, had the least amount of money, I think, and I've been through that as well, is how can you, when in the game, when my little piece, I think it was the duck, when I landed on Boardwalk, Park Place, the 2 ritziest places, I kind of made a joke that, oh, they're looking at me, or I don't belong here, I don't feel safe here, or I don't feel welcome here, because I don't have that affluence. And this is like, I'm talking about the game, but transferring it to real life. I may not have that affluence, I may not look like anybody else who's in those buildings, who owns those buildings. I think of my friends, my relatives at the Shinnecock Nation territory out on Long Island, the Unkachuk, and all the folks up there, because they're on Long Island, Shinnecocks, they're on their ancestral homelands where they've always been. Yet, when we think of Long Island, Eastern Long Island is the Hamptons too, which are the very mega wealthy, the 1%ers, and the way they're by those 1%ers, the rich people, is that we are here now, we have these lands, we have the golf championship on your Shinnecock Hills where you buried your ancestors, and yet we're gonna go play golf on there, but what are you people still doing here? That's the way they're treated by many of the people, not everybody, but that's how they're treated a lot by the people who live around. So when we think about, you know, all the game, home ownership and things like that, my nation being so, losing our land bases, I just think about the game and what it teaches, because the idea of having an individual ownership, when we look at the word historical trauma, the phrase that's been said a few times. So when we look at how many historical traumas have been, people talk about residential boarding schools, which is huge. There's a documentary in a book called Doctrine of Discovery that goes back to the year 1452, and how that is still impacting Native people to this day. You're still very much living under that Doctrine of Discovery. We talked about mental health images, and where do we see ourselves? When I was growing up in California, which is another consequence of the residential boarding schools, whole another story, but I used to watch cartoons and Bugs Bunny and stuff like all those different, and old cowboy and western movies. And there's always the Native people who they're scoundrels or the bad guys, you know, in Bugs Bunny, you know, we have, there's a couple episodes where he has Elmer Fudd. Elmer's slow, dim-witted, talks funny, talks all stupid, and Bugs always maneuvers in those situations. And then there's other episodes where there's a character who's got darker skin, long hair, carrying a tomahawk, paint on his face, leggings, moccasins, and things like that. And apparently, that other character is an Indian. Same kind of characteristics, slow, dim-witted, Bugs always maneuvers him. But there's a major difference between those two characters, because we never think of Elmer Fudd as representing all white people. But we look at that other character, and subconsciously we can say there's the Indian. Pete talked about that. You know, everybody going to Longhouse ceremony said, no, there's an Indian because he's wearing a ribbon shirt. You know, but that's where we get, a lot of times where we get those images, Native and non-Native people. And the reason I bring that up is in my own journey, like I said, I grew up in Southern California, and at one point my grandmother and her husband at the time took me to a Grand Council meeting at Onondaga. So all the chiefs were there. It was the first time I'd ever been to a longhouse, anything, any kind of ceremonies and things like that. And I was so proud and excited to be there, and I know what it was. It was the leadership of all our Confederacy coming together. And when people started speaking, of course it was in Onondaga language or whatever language that people were saying, I used to be ashamed of saying this, but now I understand it and I can share it more freely. When I heard my own language speaking at that Grand Council meeting, a little piece of me felt ashamed because I felt the people who were speaking Native language sounded dumb and stupid. And I never understood how they're my chiefs, these are people I've always been told and taught to respect and uphold. Yet why am I feeling like this? I never told that to anybody. I kept that inside a secret. I just never said that to anybody. Many years later, I was at UB, University of Buffalo. Our friend Barry White, who left us a while back, was giving a talk on the power of stereotypes on cartoons and John Wayne movies and all that, on how little kids think of ourselves. And as he was giving that lecture, all these light bulbs were going off in my mind because I realized where that conflict, thinking I needed to feel ashamed by hearing my own language, where that came from. Because it did come from those Bugs Bunny cartoons. It did come from those old John Wayne movies. And I see these, the shows still showing these pictures from the Pocahontas and all those kind of movies. Those either romanticized images of Native people or portraying us as alcoholics and drunks and stupid, or as uncivilized or wild and savage, or something super mystical. Like a lot of horror movies, science fiction movies, are based around because there's an Indian burial ground somewhere in the plot. So there's all these images of Native people. So when we're talking here about what are we, where do we belong, that is part of what we're dealing with a lot of times too, because it's been well documented over and over that U.S. history, treating Native people, has always wanted to try to get rid of the Indian problem. They first started out by trying to total extermination, total genocide of Native people. And it's well accepted among a lot of historians, anthropologists, like 95% of Native people who were alive in 1492 have been exterminated. And she was saying in the state that she comes from, there are no Native communities there. Native communities, but nothing recognized, you know. So that loss of life has been tremendous over the years. The residential boarding schools whose intent killed the Indian and save the man, horribly abuses in those boarding schools, not only of the girls, but also of the boys. Physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and sexual abuse. And I've also done a lot of research and I've done a lot on understanding boarding schools. My brother went to Thomas Indian School, and I've heard some of the most horrible, wicked violence, extreme violence perpetrated on little kids, on 5-year-old little boys, on 6-year-old little girls, that nobody, and I shudder when I even think about some of the things I've heard people saying, what they went through themselves in the boarding schools. Then you throw on these layers of the stereotypes and all these other images that we've seen. And the Monopoly game, teaching us, everybody plays, the American dream of home ownership and capitalism and accumulating. And give me mine, I don't care what my neighbor, I can send you to jail by just making up these rules and all these other things. When we talk about systematic racism and oppression, very much alive, very much here, very much we're living under that. And the thing is, that for me, one of the most frustrating things about it is that very few people recognize it. And I'm so grateful for each and every one of you being here, because residential boarding schools are rarely, if ever, taught in American education systems. The doctrine of discovery is hardly ever recognized, other than on the American side, to say, look at this great country we have, because, you know, people talk about the Confederate flag and how objectionable that is, and things like that. If you understand it, you know, appreciate that. But from a Native perspective, it could be argued or presented that the American flag represents the same thing. Because each one of those states represents a whole nation, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people who were exterminated by this effort to create the United States of America. And even when we're taught Columbus discovered us, you know, there are at least 10 million Native people who lived here. And that's not discovery. That's, you know, finding, you know, maybe he was lost and people joke about that. But there's so many of these dynamics, one of the things that I've done in my work is look at the health issues among Native communities, and there's a lot of health disparities: cancer, suicide, alcoholism, obesity, domestic violence, homelessness, incarceration, all this other stuff that's on the game. But a lot of Native people are really suffering really poorly about that. And I always wonder, how come we have this rich, beautiful culture, yet so we're so unhealthy? And that's when I also started looking at the impact of historical trauma. Stripping our identity and not even knowing where we belong. There's a concept that people talk about, living in two worlds. Thinking that, knowing that we're Native or that we should, and there's some element of shame that there's a internalized trauma and lateral oppression, internalized racism. We see that happen a lot of times. Sometimes people feel bad that I'm still learning my language. I don't know because of boarding schools and all the rest of it. But sometimes we put elements of shame on ourselves because we feel that we should. We should know our stories, we should know it. And then we get angry because we don't. And why wasn't I told? And that's that journey that we talk about, this healing journey, to understand what happened to our parents or ancestors. There's reasons why things are the way they are now. And that's why I'm so grateful for having these opportunities to share more, so that more people can understand about what happened in American history. Not just Native history, because the boarding schools, the federal policies, different areas is another layer of this trauma. In 1902, there was an act of Congress that got to be known as the Dead Indian Act. I'll leave it to your imagination what you might think that might be. But it's after the Allotment Act, which, again, back to gave monopoly to have individual ownership. That's what the Allotment Act back in 1887 enforced on Native people. Because before then, all our lands was held by the nation, by the tribe, by the community. And we didn't own it in terms of monopoly sense. But the Allotment Act forced people to have piece of paper to say, hey, I own this plot of land. Because we had never had that experience, a lot of people lost that land because they put their name on a piece of, or mark on a piece of paper, not knowing what it was, and then they gave their land away. And again, not knowing it. But there's so many systematic things that we talk about, and just finally, the environmental stuff, that's another part of that, because as human beings, all of us, our health is totally dependent on the health of the natural world. And the way things have been going for all these centuries, and actually not all these centuries, really about a century and a half. You know, all this environmental damage has happened fairly recently in the grand scheme of things. I know I'm going on and on and on, but there's so much here that we can talk about, and whether systematic oppression, internalized, questioning who we are. It is a journey that we're on, and that's why I'm so grateful that people are here to listen to these things, because part of our healing, the way I look at it, is being able to tell our stories. Because we've never been asked before. We've never been encouraged to talk about boarding schools, and what the impact it had on me personally, and my mother, and everybody around this table, and everybody here. And then people not knowing about it is another thing that I'm so appreciative of having this opportunity to share some more words with you. All stuff, because I know probably other people want to add on.
You actually said a lot, and almost every, all the topics that you mentioned, we could spend, a long time on each of them and go more into depth for people to understand us better. And I think that it's important that we do that, and here at Ganondagan, that's what we try to do. And I guess sometimes I also think, like, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but I also have to think, like, I also need to think about the educational part and knocking down those barriers, and sometimes it's not pleasant and you're not gonna hear what you really need to hear, and you're not going to like it, but maybe just accept it, and, so that we can, all move on. But it is, it's a lot, and I think that, some of those topics, we should get Ganondagan, more of those events here, and also in Buffalo too, you guys are doing a lot of good things there.
Conversations like these can be so difficult. Something I've noticed, and I just had an experience recently in the past few weeks of, I really tried to share teaching from my culture with people who just really took it personally and were really hurt by it. And I was trying to teach the idea of the good mind, keeping a positive mindset when working with, I work with corn, so working with that, trying to keep the good thoughts flowing so the corn soaks it up and whoever it goes to next can continue that cycle. And that's a really important practice that I have at work, and I try to keep it in my private life, and it can be difficult, but I make it important to keep it in my work life so that even if I'm not practicing at home, I still have it somewhere. And whenever I'm at home, if I'm going through, if I'm in like a dark spot, if I'm going through depression, I still have this space I could come back to and remind myself where to come back to. And I really tried to share this with these people, and they really took it personally. They, they felt like they were being scolded, and my intention was not to hurt anyone. My intention was to help try to shift that mindset, because I did sense some negativity in the air, and I was trying to clear it up and use it as a learning lesson, not trying to get after anyone. And I really paid attention to my wording and didn't point anyone out, was just trying to be like, here's a general statement of something to keep in mind, because it'll hopefully, with the good thoughts flowing through you, will put a smile on your face and make you feel lighter, and that'll make it more enjoyable to do the work that you're doing. And that's having a conversation like that. I understand if I were in their shoes, I honestly probably would And then I was told that I shouldn't have said that because they were leaving feeling bad and that wasn't very good-minded. And that kind of stumped me. I was so confused thinking about that. Yeah.
It's like, you know, like, that's actually like a major piece of our culture, and so what you're doing is sharing our culture.
Mhm.
And, you know, that's, you know, I know, like, when I ran the White Corn Project, you know, I told everybody about the good mind, and that's what it was based on, and so, with it being based on the good mind, you know, there was always music playing, we're always laughing, and, you know, like, you know, people were doing stuff, and that's what the good mind is that, like, positive humming, you know, of, like, this little community that's working together, and, you know, so, when, when you came home and told me that story, I felt personally attacked, and I wanted to punch something.
Yeah.
So you.
I know, so then I didn't have good mind either, you know, and I'm like, it's fucking bullshit.
Yeah, and it's hard because, I mean, thinking back to like trauma, we have to heal as a people, but we can't just keep getting better and better. To heal something that didn't heal properly, you kind of have to open up that wound again and have it healed properly. And that's kind of what thinking about this situation that happened recently was, I had to keep that in mind. It's like, that's something they have to work through. That's,
These other Native people who you?
no,
Okay,
these were
okay.
white people.
Okay.
And like, they felt hurt by it, and if they did, that's because they don't understand it. And in order to understand it, they're gonna have to open that wound back up and have it heal, or, you know, this wasn't introduced to them while they were learning.
And I think though, for you, that, you know, like working with corn over the years, and also with you, that, you know, you become very possessive of your culture and your, you know, your traditions and things that you have, you become very possessive of them. So you guard them, and, you know, if somebody's not treating them right or holding it right or whatever, you know, you kind of a little bit want to say, wait, you know, that's not the way to do it, and so you do want to correct, you know, and, you know, and I think we've all kind of experienced that in ways, and then, you know, I've gone through that too, and then kind of felt bad that I hurt somebody.
Yeah.
You know, but, I mean, so how do we go backwards and, you know, and then just say, wait a minute, you know, I'm just trying to explain something to you, and some people aren't gonna get it. Honestly, you know, and I guess that's where we had to go. Some people are gonna open up and say, I do get it, okay, I wanna hear it again, and, you know, I wanna take in, you know, what you're trying to teach me, and then that's a good point to start and move. There's gonna be other people that just won't, and, you know, and that's okay, because I think the majority of people will, you know, and things being said in the right way will be accepted, you know, and that, at least it's a starting point for all of us, you know, to start from and grow from.
That's important too, because a lot of people, Native people, are relearning our culture, relearning language and things like that. And for a lot of non-Native people, maybe they've never heard about it, or, you know, they know Native people exist, or, you know, many have seen the same Bugs Bunny cartoons I saw. So part of this conversation is not only learning more about what happened from other people's perspective, but unlearning what you've also been taught. Because if you were taught Columbus discovered America, and you saw where Columbus Day, that might be an issue that you might want to take a look at, to be more inclusive and respectful of indigenous people, and then to see what happened after that. Because on day one, there was violence on indigenous people when Columbus first came over here, and of course it's continued. So, but the other thing too is like for Native people, what I think is important for us to remember is that we can't blame anybody for not knowing what you don't know. Because if nobody taught you about the Great Lakes, or if nobody taught you about Tadadawa, or if nobody taught you about all the things that we often hold dear in other Native cultures, how come we can't really blame anybody for not knowing? And that's where these conversations are so helpful, to help people unlearn and relearn and learn more. It isn't about rewriting history. It's making sure people have a full understanding about what happened in American history, Canadian history, world history. Not just from a European American perspective, but from all perspectives.
I was just wondering. Did you have a question? You can't ask a question. Hang on a second. I was just correcting. There'll be a minute, but that's
Ready? Can you get involved? This person wants to ask a question, I said.
Unless they go to the table, no, the conversation stays at the table.
You can join the table.
If you're Indigenous, yes. We're centering the voices of Native American Indigenous voices.
You know, I know that it always questions if so much has been brought up. But I think that, you know, it's the time right now that, you know, it's kind of like you're supposed to be sitting there listening and our conversation. Yeah.
The one thing I can share, that opened up the door and I'll be, you know, interested to talk to, is in my journey, and you heard a couple people say this, we didn't grow up on the nation territory, and if we did, maybe we weren't exposed to the culture or teachings. I grew up in Southern California, so I grew up like any other American person. I learned, I was taught, if you want to meet somebody, you know, they talk about eye contact, you know, be respectful, goes up to somebody, introduce themselves, you know, extend a hand, and just do that. And there's so many values that come from American culture, and that are included in this Monopoly game as well. And that's how I grew up. But when I moved back to New York, to our homelands here, in '84, it was a total culture shock for me. Because what happens in Native community, Native culture, oftentimes does not even match American culture. And there's so many disconnects about, and that's one thing about education, because you can talk about how education may change people's values. I remember one quick story, in economic class at UB, first day of class, 400 people in the room, the professor said, the American economic system, greed is a good thing. Because it generates wealth, capital, it creates jobs, it builds factories, contributes to gross national product, and all this other stuff. When I heard that didn't sit well with me, so afterwards I went up in my culture and told the professor, asked, my culture, we're supposed to help each other, greed is not necessarily good. We're supposed to do that, and not expecting anything in return. So he stuck to his message, this is economics, this is American economic system, so he stuck with his message. I ended up dropping that class the next day, because I didn't want to be part of that system that wanted me to be greedy. But I also wondered, what about all those 400 of the students who in that entry-level, one-on-one level course? Did they get that message, and is that what's going on in the world today? And many times it is. And it's reinforced by this Monopoly game, too. The idea, get what you can, get as much money as you can, and heck with your neighbor. Not caring about your brother and your sisters, part of our human family. So, just want to add that as well.
I want to say something. I've been sitting here wanting to say it for a while. I have a problem with, the use of the word possessive, when it comes to culture. And, I think that, and this is a me thing. Cause I think that, I don't think I know that, like, there was a time where, I felt possessive of the culture. And, I had to learn to let go of that. And by the time I made it to the White Corn Project, share the culture with, you know, people outside of our culture, and, you know, like, I understand the things that we hold sacred, like, that's not what we share, that's not, you know, and, you know, and I've had to figure out how to communicate that boundary, you know, and so I don't like to think of being possessive of the culture either, because I want to understand it, but I want people to understand me, and so I have to share that part of who I am, and so sharing that is, you know, explaining to people the good mind. So I just felt like that word possessive, was stuck in there for me. Cause I don't think, I think that, our people became very rigid, and I think we're very fortunate to still have our ceremonies and have our languages intact where we can revitalize, and that's cause people, you know, I always talk about, like, you know, that's where things went underground because it wasn't okay to do that, and then, you know, when you were talking about how when you heard the language for like the first time and thought it was, you know, full of shame, and, you know, studying about trauma, you know, like it's genetic, and I thought of that being like the genetic component where, you know, maybe someone in your family felt that way because, you know, they were shamed for using their language or punished, you know, for using the language, and that is a genetic expression within you, you know, and, you know, and then the shoulds, you know, I should know my language, and, I've been working on learning language myself recently, because I'm like, I gotta quit being a hypocrite, knowing like that's the way to, you know, like, help heal my trauma, and, you know, like grab the healing light, you know, that I can be for my kids, and, you know, like in my story that I shared, you know, like, my kids are you know, I talk about my kids being my legacy, and, you know, like all the stuff that I have done is for them, you know, because what I pass on, they take, and then they're gonna have kids, and, you know, like, that's the whole, concept of the 7 generations, you know, so, and if we're being possessive of our culture, then, you know, it makes it harder to pass that on and really embody it, you know, the way that we want to, or the way that I want to.
So I want to share this thought that, one of my teachers said, you know, for a long time, we felt it necessary to keep our teachings, our understandings under a basket, hidden. And the time had come now that we had to share what we've been given as teaching to help those around us understand. And so we let it out a little bit at a time, and we have, as you said, we still have boundaries about what we share with each other and what we share with anybody else too. And so here at Ganondagan, we do share, and that's part of its mission, is to provide an insight into the history that the majority of you never heard, never learned. And as a kid, I've already said, I didn't learn, I didn't hear it. I had to learn it as an adult. But I made a conscious decision that would be what I would spend the rest of my life doing, is learning. And I would see that as helping me, who grew up in a time period when I was mixed up, you know. I saw one image of us which was very harsh, the image of people drinking, you know, it was harsh, it wasn't good. And you would think that would make me think, I will never do that. But I each of us is on this journey, you know, to come to some place of living our life as we would like it to be, to have a good life. But one of the teachings that I take seriously is our Creator intended us to enjoy our lives. And to do that, we have to find out what brings us happiness, what really makes us feel good. And that, if that's what it is, then you need to spend time at it in order to really find happiness. And if you're happy, if you like yourself, probably you're a better person to be around, you know, for others. And maybe you can help, maybe you can benefit others if you have in you that gift, whatever that gift is that was given to us by the Creator, and that has been, you know, ours to develop. Then we can share that for the right frame of mind. What she called God going evil, having a good mind.
I just want to, I'm sorry, I wanted to, but my name is Nia Rodriguez, and I just wanted to share that I felt connected spiritually with your testimonials and connected in some way, shape, or form. I wanted to share two stories. One, when I first went to Puerto Rico, I was age 16, and I was staying in a pueblo where I was told that I was, if I wasn't careful, if they caught me in the mountains, that I would be killed. And it was because the Taino Arawak of the island of the Caribbean were decimated. Like you said, Columbus never discovered the island. And it made me realize even more so that I needed to connect with my ancestry, the Taino Arawak. I attended a powwow, and I was asked, what tribe are you from? And my immediate response was, I'm not from a tribe. And he responded to me saying, don't ever deny where you come from. What tribe are you from? And it was a learning process for me, so I stopped to think, okay, Taino Arawak. And it made me realize that you should be proud of your ancestry. Of course, the educational system never would ever, because even as a child, I remember sharing or asking the question, how come you never talk about Puerto Rico as part of social studies? And the teacher said, because you were nothing but a bunch of peasants coming here because you were hungry and poor. And when I was actually doing my internship at one of the suburban schools, as I walked into the building, I had very long hair. Kids started running towards me, started touching me and saying, we got a real Indian in the school, we got a real Indian in the school. And I was like, what is going on? It really freaked me out, but then I decided that I wanted to have a class where I wanted all the children to go back to their home and talk about their ancestry, and that I would do the same. And then some parents were very upset about, who is this person asking these questions about where you come from and what was she doing there. So we have a long ways to go. I do believe that the educational system is, I love what you said about the internal racism as well, that we have it even within our own people. Peter, when you mentioned, what does a Seneca look like? I wouldn't even know. I really wouldn't know. I don't know if that's my ignorance, or is it because we're people that we come in all shapes and form, and we're rainbow people, but we're all human. So I just wanted to share that because I thought
More
that
Senecas
connection.
sitting right here in front of me.
The what? Say that again, I'm sorry.
Here's what
Four
four
Senecas right here.
Four Senecas.
That's what we look like.
You see what I'm saying? So how could you tell? I mean, I look at you and I think of my older sister in my family.
Yeah,
So-
I do that a lot.
You know what I mean? So,
I'm either Hispanic or Korean.
so you see?
Sorry.
Well, I wanted I loved math. Math was one of my favorite subjects. And yeah, one of the only reasons why I graduated is I didn't have enough credits, but I got enough credits by taking extra math courses throughout high school. And they thought I was nuts because I would do like Algebra 1, Algebra 2 at the same time, and then the next year I repeated them, not because I had to, but because I wanted to, on top of the course I was supposed to do that year. And I love math so much, and they were always teaching formulas. You use this formula, plug in the numbers, you get your answers. But then senior year, I took a college algebra class, and I had such a hard time in college algebra because the teacher, the way he taught math was not giving you the formula. He gave you how to understand how formulas are put together. He gave you the foundation of how everything is put together. And from there, you can put together your own formulas. You figure out how it's all put together, how the answer comes about. No matter what the situation is, whether you have the equations in your head or not, you're still able to figure it out. And thinking about that is going back home and going to the longhouse, we're given these formulas. We're given, this is our language, these are our ceremonies, our dances, our songs. This is what we live by, and yeah, I get that. But I wasn't as involved growing up with it, so it was hard to go home and feel shamed that I didn't know this stuff, that I didn't know our songs. I don't know our language. I know a couple of words here and there, but I can't speak our language. And what I found that's helped me is I went back to the beginning. I went to the foundation. Where do our languages, our ceremonies come from? Where did we learn them? And our first teacher is the natural world, going back to the plants, the animals, the moon, the sun, the wind. And I've changed my lifestyle. I am now a minimalist. I try to be more sustainable and low waste. I walk barefoot as much as possible to ground myself. And it's changed my way of thinking, and I'm able to understand now our ceremonies a lot better. I was able to find my foundation, and now with that, I'm able to come up with my own equations, my own formulas for life. Whereas when they were given to me, going back home, and they're like, this is what it is, this is how we do it, and I never really got those answers of why we do these things. It's just like, well, just because, just do it. And I had such a hard time with that because I didn't understand where it came from. So now I have like friends who are non-native people who want to understand these teachings and the way of life and are always curious, always have questions, and like I don't know what I'm able to share with people, and I don't even have as much to share as people hope. But what I know that I can share is that foundation where teachings came from, and I can pass that on to other people, and from there they can form their own equations, their own formulas. And that's something I want to teach my future generations, giving them that foundation instead of just the formulas.
All right, you're gonna wait, Gando. I got seniority. So, just gonna share some stories. I mean, I was having a hard time understanding what this was all about, but I mean, if the discussion is about racism, then I mean, I'll share some of my encounters over the years with racism in whatever form it can be. And I'm not talking about just not getting served at restaurants or getting followed around the department stores. That stuff is just common. It's a similar experience for all brown people. So when I lived in Nevada for a time, my father was attending university because he received a federal Indian fellowship, and you had to attend university in your home state. So he was eligible for school in Nevada. or California, because we're Washos, and we come from Nevada and California. We precede Nevada and California. So anyways, he selected University of Nevada, Reno, so that caused us to move there and live. And where we were able to live was outside of Reno. You couldn't live in Reno, it was too expensive. And the stipulation of the policy, federal fellowship, was that you could not work, which is really wild policy, right? So we'll let you go to school if you're Native American and you somehow achieve this, get this scholarship about, amongst, I'm sure, hundreds of other applicants, but you can't work, so it's another obstacle, right? But anyways, the point is that I attended a school that serviced non-natives and the Reno Sparks Indian colony, which is one of the colonies that my people could live at if you so chose. And I attended the school there, and it was great actually, because I met like some of my cousins that I didn't know, and it was actually a lot of fun, to be honest. To be with my cousins. They immediately brought me in, and we were like a gang, of Indian kids. And we ruled the playground, and when lunch came, everybody ran to the lunch line, but we walked, and they scooted back for us because we were in charge. We'd beat anybody up who was against us, And so to me, it was like heaven, because I had always gone to school in predominantly non-native classrooms. Being the only native kid, But this was different and really fun. And but at the end of the marking period, the grades came in, and I was getting D's in all of the subjects, and that upset my father and mother, because they really didn't believe I was a D student. So we went in, and I went to the classroom, and they had a meeting with the teacher. It was a young teacher, young woman, white woman, and they were sitting in front of the desk with her, and I was sitting in the back where I sit normally, in the back of the room, and they were talking about it and why I was getting bad grades and whatnot. And then my parents turned to me and they said, "What do you guys do?" And I was like, "Well, we sit back here." And they're like, "What?" And it was a row of seats in the back, and then there was an aisle that you could walk to the bathroom or to the door, and then the rest of the classroom was in front. And they said, what do you do all day?" And I was like, "Draw and like shoot spitwads at each other and goof around." And they looked back at the teacher, and the teacher was a little upset, and they said, "Why is my son in the back?" And the teacher said to her, or to my parents, they said, "Well, we thought he was just another Indian kid." And that was it. My parents stood up, they couldn't speak anymore, and they took me out, and I never went back. I went to another school. They put me in a suburban school, but they had to get special permission. It was a whole big thing. So anyways, in my lifetime, that's the kind of racism my people faced, And that's your beginning. That's how you're supposed to get your start in life, as just another Indian kid in the back shooting spitwads and goofing off and getting pushed into the next grade, barely, making it into the next grade. So that's the expectation the educational system had for us, and then you learn that that's what is expected of you in society, Anyways, the second instance I want to tell you about is, I was in, I moved back here to Rochester and went to school. I went to school at West Arundecoit High School. And it was the mascot was the Indians, And I had originally attended McQuaid Jesuit High School, and it's its own story, but we couldn't afford to keep me there, so I went to public school after that as a sophomore. And first week of school, you have a homecoming football game, and turns out 2 people followed me from McQuaid to West Arundecoit, so I already had a little clique to hang out with, And they knew who I was. I've always been proud of my my heritage, proud of my ancestry. We always represent as Native everywhere, regardless, and to distinguish ourselves from other brown people, you know. We're proud of that, and we want people to see us and know that we're around, so I've always done that. And so my friends knew I was Native and went to the homecoming game. And they were the Indians, right? So like this, you know, big banner, and then this Indian guy comes bursting out into the field. He's got a big warp on it, and he's hooping it up. And, you know, I just was like, just wanted to melt into the stands. I was just not, I just didn't want to be there. And my friends were kind of like looking at me side-eye, you know, like, what's he gonna do? What's he saying? What's he thinking? And I just got up and left, you know. But the point of the whole story is that I just didn't want to go to any of the sporting events anymore. I just didn't want to subject myself to it. So I just didn't do it, you know. At McQuaid, I was an athlete. I wrestled, played basketball. But at West Arundequoit, man, I just didn't want to do it. I didn't want to deal with it, you know. And it was like, yeah, as a young kid, that was my response, was like, I'm just gonna avoid it, you know. And that's what I did. But later, they had a discussion about mascots, you know, and I started thinking about it more and more and more, you know, what it meant. And I thought to myself, like, man, I'll be damned if my kids go to school and feel like they're not part of the school, just like everybody else, you know? So, you know, that's, you know, how I set my mind now, you know, is to try to fix that. I don't want anybody's kids to have to feel like they don't belong, you know. We should all feel like we belong, wherever, you know. And
I just want to follow for a minute, but I want to hear this bird. So at one point, the Irondequoit schools called me, and they wanted me to come out because they were going to change their mascot, and they were going to stop being the Indians, and they were going to become the Eagles, I believe. And so they were very proud of that. And so they asked me if I would help plant a white pine tree. The white pine is a symbol for us of our Confederacy. Its needles grow in clusters of 5, just like our 5 original nations. And so I agreed I would go out and do that. And Ronnie Rader, who used to work here, another Seneca woman, went with me. And we had a small ceremony in the courtyard at West Arundequoit, I think it was. And we planted a white pine tree. About, I don't know, 3 or 4 days after we planted the tree, someone went there and sawed the tree down. And the tree was lying in the courtyard. And they called me up from the school, and they were very embarrassed and very apologetic, you know, about what had happened. And they promised to replant it. And I know they did, you know, but it's interesting how one of the responsibilities I kind of inherited was going into schools and trying to explain why we didn't like mascots at their invitation, at the invitation of the school. And then when I would go there, the people that would get all excited and angry were the alumni of the school. And they would turn on me as the subject of the problem, you know, because I was there to take away their mascot. And I try to explain to them the whole reason for me coming here was because the Commissioner of Education in New York State asked schools to examine the idea of mascots. And at the invitation of the school, I then went there to talk about the subject and try to explain it to them. It hadn't been initiated by me, it was actually initiated by the Commissioner of Education. In a few instances, there was a lot of resistance. In other instances, there was agreement that it was time to change. And so I lived through that time period of this grudgingly changing, and in other cases, people understanding the need for that to happen. So I've seen both sides of this, I don't know what you call it, this stereotyping.
Just the other two, 3 weeks ago, the one senator, former senator from Pennsylvania, said before Europeans came over here, there was nothing. Native people had no civilization, didn't do anything, no influence, no contribution to the world today.
There's really people who think things like that, because I remember being in high school, I mean, throughout high school, the past 10 years or so, I've been working at the Lake Wind Project, and when it first came here to Ganondagan, we were doing a lot of outreaches, we were going to farmers markets, and educating, and selling the corn. And I got a lot of people who were confused and genuinely thought Native people were extinct. And to think that there are people out there who are taught that. And there are people who think boarding schools were so long ago. And the last one closed not that long ago, was it the 80s, 70s? 96, 90s. And there are people who think that the genocide is over, and it's not. I mean, if we're looking at pipelines, that's a form of genocide. And with Standing Rock, and even there's a friend of mine was telling me about this video she saw of this woman talking about a pipeline near her ancestral land that they're currently building on, and they grow rice, but the pipeline is using up so much water that it's draining from their rice fields, and they didn't have a good harvest because of that, and that's suffocating their culture, and that's a form of genocide.
Not only people who didn't know it was completed, there are people who say it should be completed, the genocide. There's still people who don't want to kill us.
Yeah.
It should be the genocide.
Well, that's the thing too, is we're like a reminder of like their demons, if you think about it. If they were proud of it, they would have put it in their history classes. And if they were proud of it, they would treat us better. There would be less racism towards us today if they were proud of that history and those things that they had done. And my story with racism was more intergenerational growing up. My dad was a faith keeper, and he's kept me pretty grounded in our ways and our mindsets. And so I'd always done my best to walk with peace, power, and righteousness. So, and the school that I went to, their mascot was the Tigers, but there was a school nearby with the mascot, the Redskins, and they took care of that after I'd already graduated. But at school, they're more or less used to Indigenous kids, because Tonawanda is right next to it, the territory I'm from. It's right next to this town. And so we've been going there for ages. And so I hadn't had much real experience with racism at the school, because if you were racist to one of us, you were racist to all of us, and you generally didn't have a good day if you did that. But it was when I got to college that it had been more blatant. And most of it was ignorance. It's institutionalized to the point where, because there's nothing taught in our history classes, that people didn't know who I was. I tell them I'm Seneca, they ask me if I lived in teepee. They say, oh, I went to your territory to buy cigarettes. I'm surprised to see so many modern homes. And so, it was the little things, but mostly it was tokenizing. I was one of the few Indigenous kids there. I believe in the time I was there was only 4 of us. And I had been very vocal about myself and who I was. Because I got there and I'd seen everyone's attitudes towards me, and I realized it's sort of my duty to educate. And I guess that's sort of why I'm here now today, working here. I interned here in 2019, actually as a part of my school's programs, but it was tokenizing. I was that Indian kid walking around, someone asks, hey, do you know Bird? And I think, Bird? Yeah, you know, it's the Indian kid with the long hair. Like, oh, okay, Bird, yeah, I've seen him, I've heard him talk, I've heard some of his stories, you know. It wasn't always on purpose with the generation that I'm in. It was with some of the professors that it got difficult. Because there are many ceremonies where I have to be home for extended periods of time to properly participate. Obviously, Longhouse is a lifestyle, and I don't have to go to be a good Longhouse person, but there's not many men on my side, so I decided to stay home and to school at the expense of my grades. And I would explain this to a lot of my professors and tell them, this is why I'm going home. This is what it means to us. This is what it means to me. And they say, okay, well, that's not an excused absence. So you get 3 unexcused absences, and then I start lowering your grade for being away. And these ceremonies usually take about a week. So my grades start suffering the longer I stayed home. And I tried talking to my advisor about that, but there was little that they could have done. There was little that you can do to fight their indiscreet personalities towards me. And of course, I had those professors who were good. I had those people who were good to me as an Indigenous person. And it sort of was difficult finding out who was who. There was a multicultural association at CUCA where I went. And they asked me to do presentations in November for Native American Heritage Month. But they never advertised them as good as they advertised other events. And I just graduated in 2020, had my commencement just a few months ago because of COVID, you know. And in my senior year, I asked ahead of time, months ahead of time, would it be okay if I wore my regalia to graduation? And they told me no. And so I asked them again, would it be okay to wear my regalia during graduation? This is what it means to me. This is what it could do for you. It would make your school look very diverse. And they said no again. And so I talked to my advisor, and we asked again a 3rd time. And that 3rd time, we just left it. My parents were done with it. I was done with it. If I'm going to go to my graduation with a good mind, I just got to leave it be. And so I finally got there, and a kid walked in shorts, t-shirt, and barefoot. So at some point in that ceremony, I thought to myself, is it because, as they put it, the regalia wasn't fitting to the ceremony, or was it because it was me? They used to put to their class years a nation from one of the 5 nations. There was people named Tuscarora, Oneida, Seneca, but they had a Seneca kid there, and they could have made right their behaviors in the past, because part of their Spirit Week, they dressed up and had Native American ceremonies for their Spirit Week. And finally, they had a student there who was giving them the chance to make right. Me even being there after finding these things out should have shown to them that maybe we can make right the things that we've done in the past. And I'm always willing to give somebody the chance to make things right. And so they had their chance and they didn't take it. And so I sort of just walked the stage and just got done with it. But most of my experience is intergenerational, be it trauma or stories my parents told me. They have their stories of not being served at restaurants. They have their stories of all these things. But one day I sat in class and we were talking about right away doctrine of discovery. But I was zoning out, so because I have these non-native men telling me about the doctrine of discovery, and I'm thinking, here we go again. Here we go. And they're not gonna ask me how it went for us. And so I'll just finish this up really quick by saying, and sitting there, zoning out, all of a sudden I was met with pain and agony that my non-Indigenous roommates couldn't understand. And they didn't even try. They didn't even try to understand why I felt this way, sitting in a school in our ancestral lands, why I was so flustered. And so, in order for us to quell the institutionalized and intergenerational racism, we need to begin to heal ourselves of those difficult feelings of pain and agony, at least in my opinion, and sort of face where we are, face where we want to be, so that we can bring our non-Indigenous peers up to speed. And that, I feel like, is why, a lot of the reason why I'm here today. Fate just works out that way.
Sure.
Last one.
Catherine, and I'm part of the Oneida Nation, Turtle Clan. And I just wanted to mention that a few weeks ago, my son graduated from West Irondequoit High School as a proud Eagle. I'm also a teacher, and been teaching 6th grade for the past couple years, but for many years I taught 4th grade, which is obviously New York State curriculum. And yes, we're talking about the textbook. There's a very small little section, with those pictures that just kind of go by. But maybe I've just been fortunate with the teachers I work with and the district I work with, but they've always been very open to, like, maybe we don't use the textbook, you're gonna look for authentic text to use with the students and make sure that they understand the true story. And usually I do start off by asking my students, 4th graders, who do they know who's Native American? And it's always one or two that think that yes, all Native Americans they're gone, they're farther past, they're not alive anymore. And then I start showing them pictures of my family, and obviously I don't look as Native American as my mom and my grandmother. But I want them to understand though too that you don't always know just by looking around you what everyone's background is, whether it's from cultural, who you're raised by. I just want them to be open to that. And usually within a few weeks I have kids that come back and say, oh, my grandmother or my aunt or my cousin, I didn't know. So I know they've gone home and they had those conversations, which is part of my point with them. And also just looking for any way I can embed, the true stories of, what people went through. And you look at the textbooks, being a critical thinker, well, who wrote the textbooks? Well, why does the United States not always, if we're using this textbook, why are certain things not mentioned? Why is there not a huge section about Native Americans or about internment camps like in Japan, in the United States with the Japanese? And in 6th grade, we talk about biographies, and so I started off with Jim Thorpe, and asked, the top different athletes who's Jim Thorpe, and then kind of bring in the residential schools. And one of my coworkers, a couple years ago, when I went to 6th grade, about 26, and I was, sharing with her what I was doing, and she's like, what do you mean? Like, she had no idea about the residential schools or who Jim Thorpe was, and she went home and she came back, it was, I laughed at it, but she was like yelling at her parents, how come you didn't tell me about this? How come I didn't know about this? And it kind of goes back to you don't know what you don't know, and just trying to make people aware of these parts of American history. And again, just making sure they're questioning and thinking about who's telling the story and whose other story should we be listening to.
Thank you. This is, I guess we're gonna wrap it up, although Shar joined us.
All right. Shar will be the last one, because we're already like.
And let me explain really quickly, at the long table, and it happens every time, there's an end but no conclusion, which means that there have to be more conversations.
Yeah.
So, just want to throw that out.
Yes. Shar?
Well, thank you for letting me tell my story. I was trying to think of, if you can hear me, I was trying to think of a way to tell my story. And I think Lauren gave me that in because I thought about it. I believe it was you, Lauren. And she had said about identity theft and United States being the first to do that. So So my story's a little different, but I do identify as Indigenous. I identify as Indigenous of Cherokee, which was on my dad's side. On Martinique, I believe my great-grandfather could have been Carib in Africa. And African people are Indigenous people. And as a young person, I always wondered, because my mom, I was born and raised in Boston, Massachusetts, and we were called colored. You know, we were colored and then it was Negro, and I was saying, what the hell does that mean? You know, and then, and Negro, that sounded like a disease to me. But anyways, as I got older, Black Power came out. So then we started identifying with being African, with a kinky hair and darker skin and bigger lips. So I said, okay, all right, we have ancestors from Africa. And actually, when I was younger again, Africans were the ones running with bones in their nose, and then Tarzan was the Wana, you know, of the jungle. Everybody was scared, but the Africans were scared of this white man. So my dad had told me that I had Cherokee, so I said, okay, so I can identify it. That's Indian. So my connection with Indians were, oh good, then that's part of me. I felt good about that because I didn't know what the other side really was. But through the years, to make the story a little shorter, I always kind of wondered. I mean, my mother, she kind of wanted me to be colonized, and I did the things we were supposed to, but I always knew there was something more to who I was as a person. You know, I wasn't these people. You know, I wasn't colored Negro. Black is the color of a crayon. Africa, I have African ancestry, but, you know, Africa is a continent. So who are my people? So I came up here to Rochester. I got married, my ex-husband came up here. And I had the wonderful opportunity to meet the Haudenosaunee. And I was welcomed into their community and started listening and watching and learning about their stories and just hearing who they were as a people. And then I started thinking, I felt that listening to the stories helped me to connect to my ancestors, who they were as original people, because that's what Indigenous people are, original people of their territory. And I started beginning to remember, because I also got involved with Puerto Rican, because that's Caribbean. I know media from that, and just all of these people I have been around, these Indigenous wonderful people, just started waking me up as a person, and knowing that I am not this colonized African-American Black Negro. I'm not trying to say anybody who identifies with that is wrong. But I feel I stand on the shoulders of my ancestors. They were not, get emotional about it. They were not able to speak their truth. They weren't able to tell their stories. Because of being punished or being lied to. And I know my mom, she did what she did to protect me so that I wouldn't get hurt by saying these names, because she would get, my grandmother looked like a native, and if you called her native, she would pick up a knife or something and hit you with it. She would say, I'm not, I'm colored, I'm colored. You know, I just wonder now, because of things I know, how they must have felt having to lie about who they were as a people. They couldn't even say what they were. They couldn't pass nothing down. I was punished if I even went in one direction, or if I acted. When I was a kid, I heard someone say they ran on the ground barefooted and enjoying it, and I was too blind. I went to charm school. My mother sent me to charm school. Well, I literally had to walk around with a stupid book on my head, trying to be a lady, you know, trying not to be this Indigenous girl that ran with her shoes off. We went to Martha's Vineyard. Enjoy. My mother wanted me not to be that way. No, you had to be a lady. So I was fighting, you know, with this side, and my mom trying to protect me. And I didn't know back then, because my mom and I would butt heads horrible. When I got married, she was trying to get me to look in this, what was it, Emily Post back then? I said, I'm not white. You know, I don't want this, but I had to. So, you know, there's a lot of things that I could go into, but there's a lot about my people that I don't even know, because they couldn't even tell the stories. But I think being here in the Haudenosaunee community to help to wake that indigeneity up inside of me, to know what that is, and to be proud, as you were saying, being proud of that connection, the ancestors, the roots, the the soil, and I know my mother's mother, my grandmother, she was Indigenous, because I didn't know that until being around the hood and showing how she worked with the earth. I mean, we washed dishes and she had things growing, and she said, throw the water on the plants, because it fed them. And she didn't say that, but I kind of, from working in the white corn and all, kind of known about the soil, how to replenish the soil. She used to go coal hogging. So I did have the experience of being in it, but not knowing what it was. We coal hogged, we crabbed. This is, again, on Martha's Vineyard. But I didn't know what the connection was until now, and seeing that. So again, I identify Indigenous, and that's who they were, and I'm proud to be able to stand up here and say that, and be with my brothers and sisters, and, you know, of all nations, brothers and sisters, because we all are Indigenous people, and a lot of us have lost our way. So I just say, Wado, and Turkey, and Yawa.
Okay. Well, sounds like, we have many more conversations to have, and, I noticed that people were writing notes on the paper around the table, and, we're gonna keep that, and we're gonna look at it and see what other programs that we can come up with for Ganondagan. And we really appreciate all of you, you know, for coming here and listening. So thank you. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
I do want to say one thing before we leave. This was a part of a series, and there's a third conversation from 2 to 5:30 tomorrow at RMSC, and the focus of that conversation are immigrants, migrants, and refugees. And so we've partnered with a lot of people from those communities, and so you're also welcome to come there.
What is RMSC?
I'm sorry, thank you, John. Rochester Museum Science Center on East Avenue in Rochester.
And Pete?
Pete just asked if I would close up, so I have to use some of those words I used